Welcome to The Fork in the Road with Perry S. Kaufman, business strategy for founders of private companies. This is the place to evaluate where you are and where you're going on the business lifecycle journey.
Welcome, everybody, to the Fork in the Road podcast. I'm your host, Perry Kaufman, and this is where we really get to explore the real-life experiences of those that are on what I refer to as the founder's journey. Today, I'm really excited to have somebody I know well, a friend of mine, Jon Sayah, who has a unique background that I'll describe briefly, and then we'll get into it. But he is, I'll call him maybe a co-founder, but he and his dad had a wonderful company that I worked with. And I guess we had a transaction about maybe 7 years ago. And the reason I think it'll be a fantastic conversation with Jon is that anytime you take a company to market, there are a lot of potential glitches and issues and details that have to be ironed out. And Jon touched many of them. And so I think it'll be a really interesting and valuable conversation for you listeners. So without further ado, thank you, Jon, for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So I like to start kind of all the way back toward the beginning, including, in this case, childhood. Oftentimes parents influence kids as they're growing up. But in your case, since I know I don't want to spoil the story, but ultimately when you and your dad got together and ultimately ran the business and sold it, I'm interested what you knew about, as a child, what your dad was doing and how that evolved, and kind of take us up to the point where you finished your education, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Yeah, so I'll start a little bit at the beginning. My dad bought a fluorescent assembler in 1964 in Dallas, Texas. It was a two-man fluorescent assembler that made commercial lighting fixtures for office buildings mainly. And he bought it for $50,000, and his mother loaned him $5,000. So it's quite a success story when you hear how it all ended up. So in the next few years, he had no lighting background. He is a great learner. He was willing to make calls and meet people and figure out what to do. And he grew that little fluorescent assembly facility that he had in downtown Dallas to where he needed to move to a larger facility. But he still had the original facility, and this was about 1968. And Dallas was starting to really come into its own and grow, and a lot of new housing. And he was building a house and couldn't find contemporary lighting. So he and my mother went to New York and found some contemporary lighting. And he said, why don't I put a lighting showroom in this space that he was abandoning to go to a larger factory for his fluorescent manufacturing? And so he started a second division, which was Lights Fantastic. So he had the fluorescent assembler moving and doing well in the commercial business, and then started a retail business in the late 60s called Lights Fantastic that would go on to have as many as 30 showrooms. And he was a great entrepreneur who focused on finding great products. And one of the products that really gave him a lot of impetus was ceiling fans. Now ceiling fans are pretty much a norm in most homes, but back then they were not. Air conditioning was working well for people, so they had stopped using ceiling fans. But he had somebody come visit him, and this is typical of my dad. Somebody came visit him who had 30 ceiling fans from a church and said, do you want to buy them? I'm taking them down. You can refurbish them and sell them. So he bought them. He cleaned them up. He ran an ad in the Dallas Morning News. And the next day, he sold all of them. And so we started selling more and more ceiling fans. He opened ceiling fan stores around the state of Texas. So anyway, getting to me, I was, a young child, and my dad started to have over 10 showrooms in the DFW area. And he would work mainly at the manufacturing facility during the week, and he would go and travel around the showrooms on Saturday mornings. And so I would accompany him on Saturday mornings to each of the showrooms. And during the summer, I would work in the warehouse at the fluorescent assembler. So I was in the business really from age 8 or 10. And I always enjoyed it. And of course, I liked being with my father. And so, I dreamed of being in the lighting business. I didn't dream as much about being an entrepreneur, but in the lighting business. And I remember playing a lot of basketball by myself in the backyard, thinking about what would a lighting showroom of the future look like. So I was a little bit nerdy in that way. And so from a young age, I wanted to go into the business with my dad. And as I graduated from business school at University of Texas and was looking for a job, he said, I'd rather you go work somewhere else first before you come into the business.
Well, John, let me ask you a question for a second. So first of all, I didn't realize you were 8 when you started working with your dad. So he obviously didn't know much about child labor laws.
Right.
But and I know your dad well, so it fits. I'm not worried about that. I didn't realize this, so I'm glad you raised it. So you had some visibility and exposure to all this from that very young age. And did you think about it as you were in business school and so forth, I guess? Is that right?
I didn't really think about it in that way as much as I was in lighting school. And I loved the idea of, can you grow and make lighting more important in somebody's house? We had tent sales where we were selling hundreds of fans in a weekend. And so it was a lot of fun, and the business was strong because Texas was growing. And so it was just a way, I think, for me to bond with my dad, and I enjoyed the other employees. And so it was just seemed like the natural path for me.
Did it shock you when he said, well, no, I don't want you to work for me when you were getting out of school right now?
It a little bit, but I thought that it made sense, and luckily he was a large customer of one of the largest lighting manufacturers in the country called Lightalier, and he asked Lightalier if they would hire me. And at the time, the head of sales of Lightalier came from General Electric. And General Electric had a program of hiring sons of distributors, sons of GE distributors, and sort of branding them GE, and then sending them back to work with their dad and continue to buy from GE. So they had this sort of program where they hired me. They hoped I'd work there for 2 years, and then I would come back to my dad's business and continue to be a large customer for Lightalier. So I did that, and I had a nice job and some nice mentors at Lightalier for 2 years, and pretty much on the nose, I said, I'm ready to come home. And I came back to my dad's business. Unfortunately, when I came back, we were going through the oil shortages in Texas and the oil crisis, and the economy wasn't as strong as it had been when he was growing on an upward tear. And ceiling fans went from $230 to $250 a fan to $39 a fan because of China imports and Taiwan imports. So the business was struggling. I came back. I had done well at Lightalier. It was a large company, and I thought I knew everything at 25. And my dad didn't think I knew everything. He thought I was still the 8-year-old boy that he would take around. So we immediately clashed. And after about 8 months, I decided that maybe this wasn't for me, and called Lightalier back up. And luckily, they took me back in a product manager role, where I ended up staying for 15 years away from my dad's business.
So I want to focus on that for a minute, because this is one of the topics that I was alluding to earlier, in that often founders face and I refer to it simply as family dynamics. And it's, sometimes there's a lot of people involved. In your case, it was really just you and your dad as far as family goes. But it's a huge issue because in my experience, I've worked with a lot of father-son situations, and there's just a confusion as between what the relationship is like in the business context and the personal context. It's really hard to separate that. And can you think, is that the way you felt, or did you know at the time, or looked back on it later and recognize that?
I mean, I think there's two dynamics that happen, and I've talked to other people in my position that sort of give me some of this experience of what happens. One is, I think the father continues to look at the son, as I said, as an 8-year-old, and doesn't have necessarily the same respect that when I went to Lightalier, they had of me and in my role, and not knowing me as a kid, but only knowing me as somebody who worked hard and made some good suggestions. The other issue is really what the other people in the organization think. And, that's where it becomes a little bit of a problem, because he had some very good people that worked for him at the time who I'm sure felt a little bit nervous about my role and my capabilities and what I could bring to the table and what was going to happen to them. And was there some sort of favoritism being played?
Nepotism, they call it. Yes.
Nepotism. And so I think that played a role as well. So I think, that there was a perfect storm when I came back, that, I was very cocky from my success, or what I thought was my success at Lightalier. He was still wanting to run the company and have his thumb on things. The business was struggling, and the other employees were nervous. So I think all of those things together made for a situation that maybe wasn't the best dynamic. But I think, in retrospect, the idea of going and getting experience was, a great idea. Probably I came back too soon, and I didn't have an appreciation for how well my dad had run the business, how he had developed the business. And I'll just correct one thing you said at the beginning. I don't see myself as a co-founder. I see my dad as the person who took it from 0 to 1. And then I definitely helped taking it from 1 to 2. In that way. And I think that it's important to make that distinction, because I think only once I understood that I had to really understand what my dad built, respect him, and he the same for me, that I could then, really help try to grow the business from where it was instead of where I wanted it to be.
Yeah. You got the ability to get on the journey after a lot of the hard work was done. Not that there wasn't hard work ahead of you, but the really ground up. The other thing I think you and I have talked about before, and I know this because I was, as I said earlier, working with your dad. He was probably early 50s at the time that you came back. And in his mind, he was not like going to begin to do a formal succession plan at that stage of his life and or at the stage of the business. And maybe you thought that was the natural expectation from your perspective. Is that the way you kind of?
Yeah. And again, I had some very good mentors and some good experience during my 2 years at Lightalier. And I immediately thought I could bring some of these ideas to his business and to change his business to some of the things I saw at Lightalier. And I didn't appreciate the uniqueness of his business, the way he ran things. And so I think, it was a joint effort in making it a difficult situation. He still had a lot of ambition. I had ambition. We had some different ideas. And I think, we then went our different directions for 15 more years. And I think that maturity that definitely I got, and I wouldn't say he got maturity, but I think he got more on understanding of succession planning 15 years later when I did come back.
Yeah, I want to touch that. So when you came back, first of all, my gosh, 15 years at the larger company in the same industry, and I know you were successful, and I'll let you expand on that, but you certainly were learning a lot. And I talk about framing, the predictable business life cycle. And as Fleeco, your dad's company, grew, it was getting into a need for more professionalized management and so forth. And we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, I've worked in a lot of succession planning processes, and they're always challenging. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about when you came back, and then it was, A, you had a lot more experience, and B, it was pretty much understood that there was a succession planning, process that had to be undertaken. And your dad was mid to late 60s at that stage. So sometimes, and again, knowing your father, reasonably well, it's just hard for what I call the successor to really do a great job of empowering the successee. They have a hard time letting go of things that they feel are essential, that only they can do or they like to do. So as you embarked upon that the second time when you came, what thoughts do you have about that? Do you recall?
I think there was a couple of things. One is, we had the luxury when I came back of having multiple divisions. We still had a nice showroom business. We had a nice manufacturing business. And my dad really loved the manufacturing side. He loved purchasing. He had some things that he also didn't love as much, dealing with some of the personnel issues, dealing with some of the retail issues. It had been a up and down 15 years for him. So he was ready to exit some of the responsibilities that he had, and to focus on those areas that he really enjoyed. And at this point, I understood, where I could be helpful, where I could have my role. And so at the beginning of the process, when I came back in 2003, I focused on those areas that, were sort of in my bailiwick. He focused on those areas that were in his bailiwick, and luckily they didn't cross too much. And then we had a lot of what becomes, if you will, luck, is that the business was doing well. So all of the divisions were doing well. We made some enhancements and some additions to the business. They all worked out. And so when things are going well, all of a sudden the relationship is doing very well. So, the first time I came back, there was some headwinds. The second time I came back, we had a lot of tailwinds, and he was ready. He was really the consummate, founder looking for succession. So he isn't the one that you have struggles with in your business, and telling them how to follow a succession plan. He was really, very adaptable. When you worked with him on succession, I think he was a willing learner of that, and that made my life much easier. And again, I lucked out into having some early successes that, let him feel like, he could let some of the reins go.
Yeah. He built confidence, in you. Yeah. I recall, and it makes sense. So the other thing I want to touch now is, when companies get to a certain size, and because the business was doing so well during that stage, they have needs that they really didn't have before. And I categorize that as professional management. And I know you made some additions along the way in terms of talent, bringing it in, that ultimately were essential to later the transaction, which we'll get into later. But was that something that your dad was open to at that time, or did you push him a bit on that? And if so, how'd you talk about it?
A little of both. I mean, I think that, we were at the size where we had individual heroes that were really helping us make the large contributions.
Yeah.
And so, I did, from my experience at Lightalier, which was a public company and had a board of directors, I did have more of a sense as to what a professional company looked like.
Yeah.
And I knew that it would be difficult to continue to grow, which was really in my DNA from Lightalier, that growth is everything, that I would have trouble continuing to grow with individual heroes, and I needed to begin to have a more professional management. And again, luckily, my dad was open to me, making those changes. He didn't always make it easy for those new people or enjoy it. We had no meetings when my dad was running the company. He was very seat of his pants. He made a lot of smart decisions, but he liked to do it his way and not with, a sort of team of people that chat about it for an hour. So he got frustrated with some of the process, but again, he was very good at allowing his frustration not to overtake what I was doing. So he was he didn't love it, but he let me do it.
Well, that's really good to hear, because I remember those details, but I will say that oftentimes it's harder for somebody in that position to let go. But I think the experience that you had and the early wins that proved up his confidence certainly was a big help. So I know, directly the CFO was a big add and upgrade. Were there other areas that you intentionally brought new talent in?
Well, we did a couple of things. The CFO was a huge area. We didn't have the systems, both computer and inventory controls that we should. He worked hard on that. We didn't have some of the manufacturing processes that we needed, so we brought somebody in on the manufacturing engineering side. And then we added some divisions, again, with some strong people. We got into the multifamily business, which back in the 2010s in Texas was growing very well. And then there was a lighting retrofit business that was doing well as warehouses were moving from HID to fluorescent and then to LED. And we got some people who focused on that business. So we brought in a number of people. And, again, my dad really did a great job of allowing us to really increase the overhead. And luckily, we were able to increase the sales, so it wasn't as traumatic as it could have been if it was on the come kind of additions.
Right.
We were doing well, and we were able to absorb the professionalism, better than it would have been had we not been able to continue to grow at such a fast clip.
Yeah, I know that was not your dad's first instinct to invest in what he would consider overhead type of items, but obviously it paid off, and that was great. I know I talk a lot about, if people have heard me and I've mentioned to you, this concept of VUCA, and the fact that, the world at large is changing at a very fast pace. Technology has a lot to do with it and so forth. But talk a little bit, I guess it was about that same time as you began to bring in professional management that you had to begin to consider and rethink a little bit about the business, right?
Yeah, I mean, VUCA, it definitely is the perfect way to describe where we were in the late 2015-20 time period in both of our key businesses. On the retail side, e-commerce and the home centers were really starting to make inroads and changing the dynamic of that business. And then on the manufacturing side, China was starting to get more into the business. And the biggest thing was the move from fluorescent to LED. So here we're a company named Fluorescent Light Equipment Company. We sold, literally $80 million of fluorescent fixtures, and fluorescent was seen as a dying industry. and moving very quickly to LED. And, LED, the big problem with LED was it took a smarter person to be in the LED business. So in the fluorescent business, there was a lot of sons of founders who were running their companies. And in the LED business, there was much more engineers and technical people. And so, we had to address that. And, we had some good ways to address it, and we certainly had some issues in addressing it.
And correct me if I'm mistaken, you were maybe a little bit behind the leaders who had stepped out into LED. And so part of the thesis that I think this, environment, and I'll just clarify for everybody, VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And really the whole idea that things change quickly and it's hard to stay up and adapt. And I know, Jon, when you had that really strong run after you got back in the fluorescent lighting area, while you were making hay then the LED people were probably beginning to launch. Talk a little bit about, how, if you felt you were behind, could catch up, what things you were trying to do or thinking about as a result of others being ahead.
I mean, we understood that LED was going to be the big next thing. And on the lighting showroom side, we actually opened an LED showroom in one of the first in that area. The problem on the manufacturing side is one that I'm sure a lot of people face, where we had a tremendous amount of investment in this manufacturing facility in assembling fluorescent fixtures. All of our suppliers were that. So while we understood that LED one day is going to come, it was much harder to move because we had, so much locked into fluorescent. And LED, which, like a lot of technologies, was being talked about and moving very slowly until all of a sudden it wasn't slow anymore. And so there were definitely companies who, especially ones that weren't as successful on the fluorescent side, who moved much quicker than we did into LED. So we were behind. And that sort of, now we'll get to, the next subject, which is, what do we do now? How do we address this issue of really being behind the eight ball with a company that had been used to 20% growth a year plus, and now was starting to struggle? And, how do we address that? And this is where, again, when things aren't as good, you can have some internal issues that aren't as fun with working with your dad.
Yeah, exactly. So, by the way, I'll step back for a second. When you were talking about the transition to LED, the new, everybody thought it was going to be a new thing, and then all of a sudden it really was. I wonder if that has alignment with AI these days. But so you began to see the fluorescent business phase down, even though it had been a great ride for many years, and you were evaluating the LED, and people were a little bit ahead of you. So then discussions started about, what's our best path here, right? What do we do next?
Yeah, the big thing that happened was, again, I was, from my days at Lightalier, I was very familiar with the market and the goings on in the marketplace and a lot of other companies. Yep. And I saw a company that I knew that wasn't dissimilar to us, which sold to private equity for a tremendous amount of money.
Yeah.
And we had a banker come in who said that he could introduce me to the investment banker who made that deal happen.
Yep.
And that really lit my eyes to have the opportunity to possibly sell, especially at a time when I thought we needed some heft of investment and some help in making the transition from fluorescent to LED.
Yeah.
So I ended up hiring a gentleman who did a number of lighting deals, including the one that I thought was spectacular, from a large accounting firm, and he really made a difference.
He was an investment banker, right?
He was an investment banker.
Yeah. Investment banker. All right, continue.
And he specialized in the lighting industry, and he helped me through what all the issues were going to be, how you do it. And we started, what was called a process to sell the business. And so, the timing of the sale was a little bit based on, we had been growing nicely, but we definitely saw some concern in the future. We saw that private equity was really starting to look into the lighting industry and believe that was a space that they could be successful. So, those things aligned at a time when we thought we should look at it. And we had a CFO that, had helped us to become a little more professionalized. We probably still were a little early in terms of our professionalization, but we thought the timing may be right. And of course, these investment bankers make money if they make the sale. So they're very encouraging of wanting to do a deal sooner than later.
Right. And because I was kind of witnessing a lot of this, the CFO that you brought in, I thought was really good, but he had a lot of change to implement. And I think, unless you tell me differently, I think he had made great strides, but he wasn't really finished getting the company to the level it needed to be. And I want to expand on that a little bit and see if you agree with this. I think he did a much better job of getting his arms around inventory and therefore getting the financials to be more accurate and timely, which is most important. What I think that was yet to be accomplished was to be able to regularly get data out of all the activity that would be able to be important for making business decisions going forward, which is, of course, what PE loves. However, I don't think that was a door closer by any stretch, because most companies that PE acquires is just not that sophisticated.
What happened is we ran a process, and when you run the process, the goal is to maximize the selling price. And we did that. We found a PE company who made an offer to outbid all the other PE companies that was a tremendous amount. And we were very excited about it. But when the PE company started to do due diligence and started to ask for data, they started to see some holes, and all of a sudden the huge number that they had told us they would pay began to go down and down and down as they sort of looked to find issues that may make it worth less than they originally thought. So we ended up pulling out of that deal. And a lot of the reason was because, again, we weren't as professionally ready as we needed to be. We were probably 50% there. And so we gave them some agina that allowed them to say, instead of paying X, we're going to pay X minus. And that gave us some agina. So, we broke off that deal. And then we found another private equity firm about a year later who had some tangential affiliation in the lighting industry, were a little less concerned with some of the issues that we had. We're excited. They were a new PE firm. They were excited to get into the lighting business. They were excited to do a deal. And luckily, they looked the other way at some of the deficiencies that the other firm did not look the other way at.
Yeah. And one thing I want to emphasize, because I tell people this all the time, and I appreciate you being the poster child of this, which is, you really need to work hard, probably 3 years before you think you want to go to market and get your act together. And it's understandable. It's typical. Again, this business life cycle, up until the time you really start thinking about something like that seriously, you don't have to be as meticulous or as much data driven as to run it. But if you are going to take it to somebody and provide all the backup and information to demonstrate the value, the top value that you know is there, you got to have your ducks in a row.
And
So,
one other point that is that doesn't seem quite as obvious is if you don't have all the processes in place and all your ducks in a row, then and you have some individual heroes that are making most of the business run. If you now turn those individual heroes to trying to manage the transaction, they can't manage the running of the business. Right. And the business starts to go down a little bit because you hadn't put in all those processes to make the business run easier while some of the executives are focused on other things. And so that's the recipe for disaster when you get into a transaction with a PE, because you really need, like with my dad that second time around, if you can go into a transaction on the upswing, your life with PE is much better than it is if you go into the process. They their model is to take on a lot of debt. And if you can't support the debt, they're not going to be able to invest in your company the way you'd like them to. And so it becomes a bad cycle if you don't go into the timing with the business really on an uptick for the next year or two after the transaction occurs.
Yeah, it is sometimes very hard for people who, haven't been through this process to understand how big of a distraction it is to work on preparing for engaging. And this is typically anywhere from 6 to could be a 12-month process. And so you have to have your ducks in a row. And even then, it's somewhat of a distraction. And you need to go into it understanding it and making sure you're backfilling some of the ongoing efforts that have to be maintained, even if somebody else has to step into some of that. So that's very typical, and I knew. So the second time around, you went through essentially the same diligence process, but you were A, a little bit better prepared, and B, a little less demanding by the buyer, I guess.
Yes.
Recall.
Exactly. So that both of those things made it much easier. But I will say, you hear when you're thinking about selling that the due diligence is a very rough process. And I think that is, something that I thought, the due diligence is rough. The due diligence is rough. And so, having somebody like yourself and having all your ducks in a row makes life a lot easier. And I think that's a critical path. And it's critical also in establishing your relationship with the PE. Because if you can answer all their questions very easily, they feel more confident in you running the business and you understanding the business and understanding their questions and the way they want to get information once they own the business. Then if you struggle with that due diligence, they're thinking, I need to make some changes here because they're not really up to doing what they need to do to help us to grow it so that we can sell it in a few years for more money.
Yeah, I tell you, the PE industry typically have fairly smart people who have the thesis as you just described it, but they really don't know much about operating a business. Okay. And they rely on sometimes they have what they call operating partners, people who know something about an industry, and they drop people in to help run, and they have experience with working with that person and it gives them confidence. Other times they do look to lean directly on, at least for, 12 or 18 months, the seller, and to make sure that they still are there to maintain continuity and keep things going well. So I want to talk a little bit about post-closing, and there's two elements, John, I want to talk about. One is a specific issue that arose in your transaction, and this happens, with some fairly, frequency. And it's this concept of net working capital true up. And I don't want to make it granular, but the bottom line is the PE firm expects to pay a price for the company, and that when they take the company over, it's got adequate working capital to run the business. They don't have to make another investment to make the business successful. And nobody knows exactly what that working capital is on the actual day you show up for closing. So afterwards, there's a number that's established. I have to have this much working capital. And then they calculate the actual within usually 60 or 90 days after closing. And if there's a shortfall, they get money from or if there's an excess, then the seller gets more money. So my message there for the audience is that even after you close, there's still some business and dollars to sort out. And I don't know, John, if you want to just talk briefly about the experience.
Yeah, the only thing I would say about it is that I think it can be a substantial amount of money. It can be a substantial issue and relationship issue between you and the PE firm. So it should be very clear how you're calculating the working capital. In our case, the issue is some of the inventory still current, or is some of the inventory obsolete? And so if they believe that you gave them more obsolete inventory than they thought, then you don't have the amount of working capital that they expected, and they want you to make up the shortfall. So in our case, the biggest issue is just that I don't know that we communicated well between the two of us what the expectations were for the inventory and the working capital. And again, it was just something that I thought was sort of a check the box. We're going to do a working capital true up, but it wasn't going to be something that we had to worry about that could cost us some money. And so, for in our case, working with somebody like you would have been smarter to get involved earlier, so we didn't have that kind of issue and cost us some money.
Yeah, at least not get blindsided. I'm going to kind of go to another topic that's a little bit off to the side, but founders, have families, and when they have a successful company, the value of that company grows, and then a lot of times it becomes the largest asset in their estate. And I'm sure the audience, everybody's heard about, sometimes you need really effective estate planning to avoid your heirs to have a big tax bill upon one's demise. And I spent quite a bit of time with your dad, John, and I'm going to try to frame the story and let you kind of tell it from your perspective. But so your dad had this issue that he had created this valuable company, and he was a successful businessman, and he had a noteworthy estate. And he has 3 children. And like many parents, their general instinct is that whatever, my heirs, are entitled to upon my death, I want them to share in it equally. However, when you have a situation where one child has made a significant impact in working in the business and enhancing the value of that company, the equal split didn't seem equitable to your dad. He wanted equity for everybody, but he felt like if you didn't, the child who was working in the business didn't have a greater stake in that value that they had helped build, that it might not be fair to them. So I will say that we had a running conversation about this, and then you were involved in some of them, John, for about 2 years, I think. Okay. And so he had to make some decisions and do something. And ultimately, we were able to create a trust structure that allowed for a limited amount of the value of the company to go to the non-working children, and the bulk of it go to the working child, and then other assets could be used to balance out, so that in your dad's mind, he could allow all the children to get a rough equivalent amount of dollars. Now, that was at the time of planning.
Let me just interrupt one thing, because you did something brilliant that is really the key to all of this, which is that you can't transfer easily the business upon death because of the estate taxes and so on. And so what you did is set up the trust so that the trust could buy the business from my dad. And so it was not in his estate when he passed. Right. And so at that point, it does change the conversation a little bit. Who owns the trust and who gets to benefit from the trust if somebody has to actually pay for the asset that is being sold? And so I think that changes the dynamics a little bit, because it makes it harder for the other family members to participate, because they could be on the hook for paying money for the business, which they're not involved in. Right. And so in hindsight, it becomes a different issue if the business does well after the transaction and after at buying it from the trust. But at the time, I think it made it easier for my dad to wrap his arms around how he should divvy up the business, because somebody actually had to buy the business, and then take that responsibility. To avoid the estate taxes. And I think that's what you did so well with him, is to coach him on how to avoid, these issues if he should die while he still owned the business.
Yeah, so there are really two different things there, but you make a great point. First of all, very simply stated, to have the business acquired, in this case from you or trust of yours, does what we call freezes the value, because now the value has transferred. And so to the extent of the business increases in value after the transfer date, it doesn't go into the state. It goes to the person who purchased it after they've paid the note. So that's one concept, and it was a big deal. And you're right, John, because you get that valuation and you lock down the maximum amount that's going to be in the decedent's estate. It also does, as you suggest, John, it makes some of the just general division of, in this case, your dad's estate, a little bit easier to be equitable for each of the children, even though they got different kind of assets, right? I know there was a big deal. Certainly you don't want, or you shy away from having ownership of a company with one person who's actually working and leading it and running it, and the other two just on the sidelines. That's a recipe for, friction. And your dad and parents, I would say, normally are trying to avoid friction amongst their children. So both of those things were important. I think the big takeaway for the listeners is, again, estate planning is really important, and early planning, because it takes multiple years for a lot of these things to season, if you will, to get the desired impact. So I think what you did well is do it at the time before the business really took off. So It made it easier for me to purchase the business at a price that was doable than if I tried to purchase it after we had made all the growth and improvements. So I think that, I think the timing that you were able to help my dad with, obviously benefited us very much. Yeah. So I really only in my mind have one more topic that may be the most entertaining topic of this discussion today, which is And I'll just frame it as, the PE folks are generally very smart, but trust me, they don't know everything. So I don't know, Jon, if you want to kind of walk them through the story after your experience working with the PE group after they own the company and how that all played out.
Yeah, I would say that, it, like a lot of things which you sort of learn too late, PE is great at buying and selling companies. They aren't great at running companies. And I think that many PE firms understand that. Some don't and feel like they have operational capabilities. But I think, like the second time I came back to the business, I had to respect the business, understand the culture to really be able to help grow it and change it. And I think sometimes PE doesn't fully understand what the key ingredients for success are, and believe that they are somewhat generic to all the businesses that they may be involved in. And so I think in this case, they felt like they had some formulas that work across all businesses. And as I said, we went into a little bit of downturn right when they bought the business. So they lost a little bit of confidence in me. And I think that started a downward spiral because then they tried to get more and more involved in the operations. And as they got more involved in the operations, it became more difficult for it to be successful because they really weren't having boots on the ground. They were sort of doing it from afar. So it was difficult for them. And so, my takeaway is twofold. One is, that they are great at buying and selling companies. And if your goal is to maximize your transaction, and not worry about what happens next, they're a great partner. And two, to make sure that the first couple of years after the transaction, if you want to stay with them, I would make sure that the company is successful those next 2 years because they will really leave you alone. They'll invest in the company. They'll do a lot of great things if you're doing well and you're paying back the debt and things are growing. But if things start to go downward, it usually is not a great relationship that follows when things are not going well. And I don't think that's, my private equity was any different than if I had sold to another private equity. They all have pretty much the same playbook and they love success and they're not as comfortable when things aren't great.
Yeah, they're not tolerant of lack of success. Yeah. I have the my own kind of experience, which is kind of what I call the over-under rule. How long does a seller stay working with the PE group? And I'd say if you make it 18 months, you're beating the odds. It's just culturally, it's just very different and very difficult. But success, like we've talked about a few times, cures a lot of things. And if there's some bumps in the road and a little bit of struggle, it's a little different story. So, Jon, you have a great story in general, but I really appreciate you being here because there's so many of these little issues that can pop up in any type of transaction, and you touched more than the average. And I don't know if that makes you feel good or bad. Hopefully neither. But you touched a lot of them, and it allowed us to kind of have a conversation to explain them and to let people know, first and foremost, really start early. If you have any thoughts about an exit, really don't wait to think about the things that you need to do in advance. And I peg it at 3 years. Really, if it's within a 3-year window, you need to start taking care of things. And I do a fair amount of that, and I like to educate people really about the process. And Jon and I have done some other discussions about his experience because, successful companies are run by successful people that are very smart. But when you've never done something like a sale transaction of a business, you just have no way of knowing. And so you need a little bit of support along the way.
Yeah, it's definitely money well spent.
Yeah. Jon, any other wrap-ups that you can think of that you want to share? Other than that it was fun afterward, right? The process
it's fun afterwards, and it's a great learning experience. There's nothing I would do it again. Again, I would go into it with a little bit different thoughts, and but it was a good experience. And I think you're right. It's something that is a momentous thing in somebody's life, and so I think it's worth a little of that extra time, money, and attention to make sure that you're well prepared.
Yeah, and I want to just reflect from my personal standpoint. I think I've said this before, but I'll tell the group again, is that I did a fair amount of this, what I call informally, advising and working with founders like this, going through these processes during my public accounting career. And when I retired from public accounting, which was, a blessing, this is what I loved to do. And so I've been working with companies that are considering things like this, and sometimes they don't pursue it, but at least they understand it better. And as in my own little world, I get a lot of satisfaction when you help somebody get to the biggest payday of their life. So,
and I will say just one last thing, that if you don't end up selling, the work that you will have helped them do is still very worthwhile. It sets them out to be more successful. So it's never money that is wasted, even if you decide that a transaction isn't, what you want to do in your future. The process will improve your business.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. So, Jon, I know, I don't know what social media addresses or anything that people can find you. I know on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
Okay. That's the best way to get a hold of Jon. And if you want to get any more detail about his experience or anything else, just reach out to him. So thanks again, Jon. And I look forward to doing this next time and seeing everybody. Take care.
This has been The Fork in the Road with Perry S. Kaufman. If you're a founder and this episode helped you think differently about where you are and where you're going, please visit PerrySKaufman.com.